In some previous lessons, we talked about getting different values into the stack, and we mentioned that you probably wouldn't use CloudFormation parameters. They're unlikely to be something you'd use in CDK, and you'd much more likely use something like this, where we're passing in an object of properties. But what if you want this value, for example our log level here, to be different in different cases? What if you want it to be different in certain accounts, or different in certain regions or environments, or whatever kind of thing you're modeling in your application? And when you've got a use case like that, the context in CDK can be really valuable, really important. Now the context comes from a variety of sources, but there are two of them that you're likely to use in your day-to-day usage of CDK. And if you're in a new project like this, you can only actually see one of the sources of context. So if I open up the cdk.json that we saw right at the very beginning, there's a context object here, or context key, and that's something that we can add our own values into. So you can see that AWS has loads of feature flags in here, but we can add any value we want, and we can say, you know, my key, and then we could make that a string, or it could be a number, or it could be an object with other keys in, and the value of that could be an array, or it can be really, you know, whatever we want it to be. It doesn't have to be a set structure, it doesn't have to be a simple value, and there's no real guidance about how you should structure these, other than perhaps that you should prefix them with your organization's identifier so they don't conflict with other bits of context. So I think it's quite good to have a think about the structure of this up front and try and standardize that within your team. So that's one source, this key here inside our cdk.json. So what's the other? To demonstrate that, what we're going to do is we're going to head over to our application in the bin folder, and I'm actually going to comment out our getting started stack. And we're going to make a new stack, and I'm going to call this one environment.ts. So let's make a new stack. So I'm going to export the class because we want to be able to import it from the bin folder. I'm going to call it environment stack, and it's going to extend stack. And we have to make sure that we extend this class stack here, not CFN stack, which is the level 1 construct for a CloudFormation stack, which is not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make a CDK stack with all the extra bells and whistles that comes with. So make sure we got the right class there. We've got stack, and then we've got our constructor. Whoops, didn't mean to auto-complete that one. And then we get 3 arguments. So we have the scope that we're going to attach this stack to, which is a construct. We have the ID, which is a string, and then we've got any properties. And I'm going to make a interface here. And of course, you don't have to use the convention of the I before the interface name if you don't like to. And then we're going to extend stack props here, which is the default interface for the shape of data going into our stack. And then we're going to say that our third argument to this constructor is some props, and they are an iEnvironment stack. And then we're going to call the parent constructor here with the scope, the ID, and the props, just like so. So that's our bare minimum stack here. And so we want to use some values inside of the stack. We want to make some infrastructure. And what we're going to do is we're going to simulate having a DNS record set up in every account and region. And we're going to put some slightly different values in that DNS record depending on where we are. So we use Route 53 for that, AWS's service for DNS. And to make a record, we need somewhere for the record to live. We need a hosted zone, which is your domain name effectively. It doesn't manage the creation of a domain name. You have to have that separately, although you can register and have domains in Route 53. But the hosted zone is just a container of DNS records, really. And we might not want to create one. We might not be able to create one, actually. There might be one that's created for us by another team, for example. Or we just don't want to manage that in this stack, but we want to manage some DNS records. And so we can look up the existing hosted zone using CDK. So let's say our hosted zone equals hosted zone the class dot from lookup. And my IntelliSense is playing up at the moment, so I don't know why it's not completing properly. And then it says it expects 3 arguments, but got 0. And these 3 arguments are the usual ones we expect. So we've got a scope to attach it to. We've got an ID, which we can call the CDK Course zone. And then we've got some properties. And the only property we're interested in for this hosted zone is the domain name. But of course, you might want other ones. So if I click into this interface here, you might be looking up a private zone, for example, and that takes a VPC ID as well. But for us, we're going to use a public zone. So once we look that up, we can then use it just like we can any other construct we built. So let's make a, what should we have? Should we have an A record? Yeah, let's have an A record. And then again, we've got to attach that to somewhere, attach that to our tree of constructs and stacks. And then we've got to give it an ID. So let's call this the homepage. And we've got to give it some properties, and we're going to have to give it some form of record name. We might actually be able to leave that out because we want the apex record. And then we want some values, which let's have a look at what the properties are for this. Whoops. So we have zone, record name, TTL, comment, delete existing. And so that extends record set, takes a record props, which is then target. And then we have record target, and we can just provide a list of IP addresses. There we go. So let's leave as much out as we can. We'll set the TTL, and that's going to be an hour. And then we've got our, whoops, got to import that. And then we've got our target, and that's going to be a record target dot from IP addresses. So it's about identifying the right abstraction for what you're trying to do. And I'm just going to set a dummy record in. I'll just use a private IP address for this for an example. And oops, sorry, I forgot to put the zone in there. So let's set that up to our hosted zone. Okay, so that is our DNS record getting created for our home page. And that's based on an existing piece of infrastructure that's getting looked up. So let's find out what happens when we run CDK. So I'm just going to log into AWS, and we can pop back and we can do an npm run synth, and let's see what happens when we do our synth. Oops, I forgot to initialize our stack here. So let's put this environment stack. Let's attach it to the app. We'll call it environment stack. And then at the moment, we don't need to provide any properties, not got anything custom going in there. Okay, so you can see with the default properties that we've got here, with nothing specified, we can't use a context provider, which is being mentioned here. And you might see in CDK that there are methods that look very much like this one, where we're doing from lookup, a static method on a construct, and they might just work. They might construct the construct, for lack of a better term, with just some values that you've entered in there. But some of them do actually have to go and find some information. And so for these ones, it's saying that we need to specify these at the stack level. So let's do that. Let's set up our end object here. And we can say the account ID, let's do process.m.cdk default account. And then we can do region is going to be process.m.cdk default region. And give that another run. Lovely. And then we've got our synth template. And you can see we've got our we've got our record here in Route 53. And that's linked to a hosted zone ID, which we didn't put into the CDK code. It's looked it up. And then we've got our dummy values, so just our silly private IP address and the time to live. If we give it a bit of a scroll down here, you'll see that a new file has just appeared, the cdk.context.json. So we didn't have this before, we just had cdk.json, and this has been automatically generated. And you can see that the key of the value we've got in here with our hosted zone ID is namespaced effectively. So it's got the type of thing we're looking up, then it's got the account that we used when we looked it up, and then we've got the lookup values or value effectively, and then a region. So what happens if we try this in a different region? What happens if we're deploying to Ireland, which is what we've got set up here, EU West 1, and maybe Frankfurt? Having just seen me use process.env.cdk default region, you might think that the next thing I'm going to do is export that as an environment variable in the terminal. But actually, CDK default region and CDK default account are taking the information that's getting fed into CDK based on where we are currently and what credentials we're using. So if I do export AWS region equals EU Central 1, then we can actually run a bootstrap because we've got to prepare this region. We haven't deployed anything in there yet. And you can see that we are bootstrapping environment, same account ID, but then EU Central one. With that done, we can actually see that we've already got this value put into cdk.context.json. If we wanted to fetch the context values without doing a bootstrap, which you normally wouldn't repeat at all, we can run a deploy, or just for testing, we can run a synth. So if I manually clear this value out just temporarily, and we do an npm run synth, then in the production of the template, we will get this second entry here. Now, I've just changed that file manually. The recommended approach for editing the cdk.context.json is to use the context CLI command. So let's do npx --no cdk, and then we would like to pass in context. Then we can see the list of all the context values, which is quite a few things because we've got all of the feature flags in there. And then we can see 32 and 33 here, which are coming from our cdk.context.json. These are the auto-generated ones. And you can see actually it's giving us a hint of how to remove one of these values if we would like to. So let's take that Frankfurt one, which is number 32. And I'm going to rerun the command again. I'm going to pass in -- reset and then number 32. And then if I go back to the file, you can see here it's already updated and that's now disappeared. So that's the recommended way of dealing with the cdk.context.json. I will note that you can also clear the whole thing with -- clear if you like, if you really want. Oops, sorry, that's a bit of a typo. There we go. And that disappears. But our cdk.json isn't affected. It's only the cdk.context.json, which is the generated values, if you like, that's going to be changed by those commands. But I think because we're dealing with context coming from multiple locations, it's quite helpful to use the cdk context command with no arguments, just to see all of the values so you understand how everything's been put together. So let's just do another synth to get that value back for Frankfurt. And then I'm going to unset the AWS region so we fall back to what's in my profile, which is for Ireland or EU West 1. And I'll run another synth. And then there we go. So as I'm sure you can imagine, this file is going to get quite big if you're deploying to lots of accounts and lots of regions. But it's really important to get all of these values generated up front and to check them in with the cdk.json and all the rest of your code. So although this is a kind of generated file, if you like, the whole point of having this file is that we freeze these to certain values. So in the case of a hosted zone, we're probably not going to create a new hosted zone with the same name anytime soon. We'll probably just stick with one hosted zone for a very long time. But for something like an availability zone lookup, we could get more availability zones in the region. Or for a AMI lookup, we probably don't want to have that AMI getting changed all the time and perhaps cause churn in an EC2 instance that's running. We want to check the value once, say, okay, we're happy, we got it, and then save it. And I think this can create a bit of a challenge when you're deploying to many places because you've got to get all these generated values before you commit the code, before you send it up to your CI pipeline. Because you need to be able to have a deterministic output. You know, if I run CDK here on my machine, I need to get the same output as a colleague running CDK, be that on their machine or in a pipeline or on their machine in, say, a week's time. Because if the AMI changes between the two of us working, and I've committed mine and done a deployment, but I haven't perhaps committed this file, hadn't put that change in, then when my colleague runs it in a week, they'll get a different AMI. The EC2 instance will be replaced, or the EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group will get replaced, and then we probably have some unintended consequences of that. So just as a recap, you've got your cdk.json with user-specified values, your cdk.context.json, which you normally wouldn't edit manually. That's the generated things from lookups, and then they're combined together to form all of the context data that your app's getting. So going back to the context object we've got here then, with our user-defined values, you might be wondering what we should do if we want to pass in something into our app that's going to change based on the account and region. And really, the structure of this is up to you, but I'll show you what I would recommend. So if you want to add an organizational prefix on this, you can. So I could put in a little one for me, and then I could put a slash in, then I could put the name. That's up to you, whether you want to go down that path or not. Then I would put in the kind of value that we're getting. So for example, we might have a different host name depending on the account and region we're deploying into. So then I'm going to start an object with the account ID in, with that key. So I'm going to grab that from the cdk.context.json. And then the next level I'm going to use is for the region. So let's have EU Central in here, and then we can have EU West, West 1. And then we could say that the host name is going to be Frankfurt in EU Central 1, and the host name is going to have Ireland in it in EU West 1. Then once we've got these, we can pass them into the CDK application. So I would recommend doing this at the highest level possible, normally in this file here where we've created our app. And the reason I would do that, the reason I would do that is it makes it the most testable, because you don't have to worry about the context when you are creating tests for your stack. All you have to do is pass in plain old arguments just like any other JavaScript object. So if we go into our environment stack and we look at our properties, and then we could put in the host name here, which is just going to be a string. And so this is really simple then. This is nothing CDK specific. It's just a normal object, normal values. And then we can take the host name and we can use it inside of our DNS record. So let's pop in the record name here. And then we can say that's going to be props.hostname. Lovely. And then let's pop over to the getting started.ts file here in the bin folder. And then we can provide that host name by saying that we're going to use the app.node.try.getContext. And then we can look it up with a key. And so in this case, the key is going to be our little prefixed value here. So let's pop that in. Whoops. And then once we've got this, we need to look at the right value for the account and then the region. Okie dokie. And you see that TypeScript is having a bit of a moan at us here because this value is potentially undefined because it's an environment variable. So if we wanted to, we could just validate that above. We can say that if you haven't got the region or you haven't got the account, then we can throw a new error and we can say you must specify a CDK default account and a CDK default region. And then the type changes from string or undefined just to string for these environment variables. And if we really wanted to, we could put them into another variable just to make them a little bit easier to read, a little bit more concise. So let's do that for account and region. And then we can just take those out there because the key and value have the same name. And then for here, this gets a little bit shorter because we're replacing it with the account and with the region. Okie dokie. So we're looking up a value based on the key that we've got here, which is we're using a little prefix for our organization, and then the account and then the region. And that means that you can have different values for any context your CDK app is deployed into. And of course, if you might not have a value, you can always use the optional syntax. So we could say we may not have this, and we may not have this region either. And if we don't have those, maybe we've got a default. So maybe by default it's global or something if there's no host name specified there. So you can just use the normal language features of TypeScript to create default values in the context. But we're going to assume that that's always set. So let's run a synth and see what we get. And I'm just going to redirect the output of synth into a template.yaml. Okay, let's clear off the clear off the npm stuff at the top. And then we can see our record set is now ireland.cdkcourse.jshows.com because we're currently set to the Ireland region. And then if we synth this in EU Central 1, we should get frankfurt.cdkcourse.jshows.com. So we're swapping out that value. You might then be wondering, well, what happens if we've got tons and tons of these values? And I think that's where you've got to make a decision point about whether you want to go this way around, where the value you're looking up at the top is at the top, and then you've got the account ID and region. And you don't necessarily have to have these. If it's only changing by region, you could just do that. If it's only changing by account ID, you could just do that. But instead here, we could go the other way around, and we could maybe just have a generic prefix for all of our settings, and we can pass those in that way. And then instead of having just a string value here, we could say then that the host name is Frankfurt. So let me pop that over there. And we can do the same again, and I'm going to replace Frankfurt with Ireland. So if you wanted to, we could use this old sort of alternative way of doing it, where the the top level is just a big blob of your settings. And then you're looking up that big blob of settings by the account ID and region. And obviously you don't have to do that. You could just do it by account ID, just do it by region. And then in the code, I'll just create a new environment stack to demonstrate this. Whoops, I'm going to change the ID. So then we could have the settings object is going to be the first thing we look up. So that's settings here. And then we look up by account, by region, and then .hostname. And it achieves the same thing. It's just about whether you want to have things keyed at the top level by the type of thing that they are, or maybe you want to have a generic object, and then you could add further settings to this. So let's say we want to deploy an EC2 instance of a certain size. So we could say instance size, and in Frankfurt, maybe we want a t3.micro. Maybe Ireland's a busier region for us. And so instead, we're going to have that as a t3.small. Same sort of thing with your Lambda functions. Maybe in Frankfurt, we would have no provision concurrency. So maybe that's set to 0, or perhaps it's a default value. We don't even have to provide it. And then for Ireland, maybe we have 100 provision concurrency or something by default. So you get the picture. We can choose different values for different cases. So there is a disadvantage to structuring things in this way, where you're using what I think is a bit of a nicer form of having it in objects. And that is if you want to override the context values using the command line arguments, the override for context values only supports strings. And this is a rich type, it's an object. So if you really wanted to use the override, which looks a little bit like this, so we could say npm run synth, and then we'd like to set the context, of key equals value. If we really had to override that, and it is a value that's changing by region and by account ID, what we could do instead is to structure the key a little bit like this. So we'll start in the same way with our organization prefix, then we'll have the thing we're looking up, and then maybe we could use some kind of delimiter like a slash or an underscore or whatever else you fancy. And then we can go all the way out like this, just as one string key that's composed of several parts. And we can look it up in a very similar way to how we look up this structure here, this object, but it does allow it to be overridden. So if I pop back to the code here and we change this to be a string of these items rather than to be looking up indexes or keys in an object, and then we can do a synth with an override. So let's just do a plain synth to begin with, and we'll redirect it into template.yaml again. Whoops, I've still got our other environment stack in here. Let me comment that out. Okay, and then we've got the record set here with an undefined value. json.com hostname, account, region, and then we've got json.com hostname. Oops, sorry, I forgot to put one in for Ireland, so let's fix that. Let's run a synth, and then here we go. We've got ireland.cdkcourse.jshows.com, and then we can override that. So let's take the full name here, run a synth again, but this time we're going to pass in 2 dashes to say we want to provide an argument to CDK, -- context, the key equals in the value, and we'll call it Bob. Why not? Then we go to template, and it's now bob.cdkcourse.jshows.com. And if we run npm run, sorry, we haven't created a package script for that yet, have we? Let's do a package script for context. Let's do npm run context, and we get the value as it's specified in our cdk.json. And then if we really wanted to, we could try this with a context override. So let's take the same key here and pop it in, and we'll change it to Bob again. And there you go, there is Bob for Ireland. All right, folks, so that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the places that we use context and how we use context. So we primarily use cdk.json for things that we specify ourselves. We discussed 2 example structures of data. So one of them was starting off with the key of the thing you're looking up, and the other one was a more generic key for a range of settings. And then we also discussed an alternative if you really need to override things regularly on the CLI. where you could instead use a bit of a namespace string. And of course, you don't have to specify the account ID and region in here. Maybe the value only changes by account ID, maybe it only changes by region. And so you have to choose what's appropriate for you and your use case. And as always, you can use the language features to get default values if you want them. So we changed our stack over to CDK default account and default region in the env property here. That let us do a context lookup for hosted zones. Let's go and see that again. Here's our hosted zone.from lookup. When we do a synth or a deploy or anything similar, it will put the values into cdk.context.json, and we can view that by doing npm run context. Once we've got the script going, we can reset values if we like with the -- reset option. We can clear everything with the -- clear option, and don't forget that we need to check in the cdk context.json and the cdk context file so that they are consistent for everyone who you're working with, and even yourself in a few weeks' time. All right, folks, there's the context.